Good morning. It is Saturday, March the 20th, and this is The Drill. And now we have the daily declaration for spiritual warfare. We will in a second. There we go. You will bind the enemy and strip him of his power. When my son sent 72 of his servants out 2 by 2 to bring them the good news of the gospel, they returned in joyful surprise that even demons submitted to them when they used his name. So do not be surprised that I have given you the power to bind the enemy and strip him of his power. He was already stripped of his power in heaven, and I saw him fall like a lightning from heaven. I am sending you to open the eyes of those who are spiritually blind, in order to turn them from darkness to light and from the power of Satan to me. Then I will forgive their sins and give them an inheritance of righteousness. Prayer declaration. Satan, the Lord rebukes you. Through his power I will bruise Satan under my feet. I bind and rebuke all hindering spirits of Satan in the name of Jesus. I will not be terrified of Satan and his demons when they fight against me, for God himself is with me and will rescue me. Because of the power of Christ at work within me, I have overcome Satan and have stripped him of his power over me. Amen. And I love these declarations because they pull no punches. They're unequivocal. They are unambiguous. They come out and say what is right and what is wrong. They make judgments, and that's exactly what we need more of. So welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. My name is Ron, and I'm the only true conservative in the United States today. So we're going to have Chapter 9, also known as the Ninth Commandment of Progressive Christianity, and more when I come back. And now I'm going to read from Chapter 9 of the 10 Commandments of Progressive Christianity. Chapter 9, we should care more about love and less about sex. As we've already observed, progressive Christianity is decidedly moralistic. What matters is not what you believe, but how you behave. How curious, then, that this approach is absent when it comes to issues regarding sex. When sex is in view, suddenly progressives are for moral freedom and moral choice. Such an approach is evident in the Ninth Commandment. We should care more about love and less about sex. From a rhetorical perspective, such language is quite effective. After all, it tells people what they already want to hear. You have all the sexual freedom you desire, and at the same time, you're a good person who is all about love. It's a complete win-win. You can maintain any questionable sexual activity, even as you congratulate yourself on your moral superiority. Gully's book expands this cliche into a full-blown argument for sexual freedom, and he does so by adopting an all-too-common strategy. Let's walk through it. Step 1, tout the moral virtues of those in sexual sin. The first step in the playbook is to show that people engaging in the disputed sexual behavior are genuinely nice, wonderful, and all-around virtuous folks. This move is designed to make people second-guess whether the sexual sin is all that bad. After all, if it's so bad, how could such wonderful people be doing it? Put another way, if wonderful people engage in a behavior that I think is wrong, then maybe I ought to rethink whether that behavior is really wrong after all. Gully executes this more brilliantly. His first example is of a couple in their 80s who are living and sleeping together outside of marriage. He tells us that they are kind. They warmly welcome people into their modest home, and that pictures of grandchildren lined the walls. Here we glimpse how Gully's strategy is largely built on the premise that something is wrong only if the people doing it are unpleasant. In fact, he draws this conclusion directly. Quote, "The home they created was one of deep love and mutual respect. Nothing about any of that felt like sin to me," unquote. But this is not the way Christians think about morality. Christians don't claim something is only wrong when it's done by unpleasant people. And we don't judge behavior based on how the surrounding circumstances may feel to us. We argue that something is bad if it conflicts with God's character, which is reflected in his moral commandments. Thus, Christians would argue that it is very possible, in fact very common, for very nice people with many other virtues to be engaged in behavior that is very wrong. It's not just serial killer types who commit sins. Even the sweet old lady next door can commit sins, even big ones. Of course, Gully and postmodern people in general do not live out their premise consistently. If being nice makes a behavior okay, then what happens when a very nice person turns out to be engaged in something they find reprehensible? Molesting children, for example. They certainly wouldn't argue in such an instance that we must accept such behavior. Step 2. Insist that God has bigger things to worry about. The next step in the strategy is to downplay God's holiness. He's not concerned about sexual sin anyway. It really doesn't bother him. He has more pressing concerns. Gully states this plainly to the elderly couple. Quote, "You know, friends, I think God has bigger things to worry about. Let's just be grateful that you have each other," unquote. One is certainly free to portray God in this manner. Indeed, progressives often portray God as a laid-back sort of fellow, a cuddly grandfather figure who doesn't want to intrude into your life, but just wants you to be happy. Yet this is not the God of the Bible. The God of the Bible is infinitely holy and actually talks a good bit about sexual activity and sexual sin. And that's not just because God is prudish and old school, but because sexual sin hits at the very heart of our humanity. Viciously assaulting marriage because it is intended to uniquely reflect the union of Christ and his church. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 32. Step 3, show that disputed sexual behavior leads to good results. This third strategic step is similarly brilliant, for at this point, Gully shows how the sexual sin brings some positive outcome, or at least how the sexual activity helps ameliorate other problems. Lurking behind this argument is an unspoken premise, namely that something is good, indeed must be good, if it leads to something good. That is, a good outcome serves as proof positive of the moral value of the behavior that produced it. In terms of the elderly couple, Gully notes that they were financially strapped, so living together as a couple enabled them to make ends meet. Also, they were lonely and needed the companionship. This strategy works well, of course, because anyone who then insists the couple should not be living together in this way sounds like they are a callous to the couple's financial situation and care nothing for their loneliness. Once more, however, this is not the biblical perspective. One can still be very compassionate and sympathetic about the situation while also reminding them that they need to follow God's guidance for sexual activity. The two are not mutually exclusive. Moreover, Christians should challenge the underlying idea that difficult circumstances justify sinful behavior. An inability to pay my rent does not give me the right to rob a bank. And I'm sure the postmodern folks would agree with that. Yet, that is essentially the logic they're trying to use to whitewash sexual sin. Step 4, portray those who are against certain sexual behaviors as mean-spirited and cruel. Every good story has a foil, a nemesis you can cheer against. In this story, the elderly couple, Gully describes the church elder who first informed him of this couple's situation. Instead of the warm, positive description given to the elderly couple, this man gets the opposite. He's portrayed as critical, unduly upset, one who roundly condemned others and was eager to enforce his rather extensive sexual code. Gully even implies he's financially stingy and unwilling to help this elderly couple. According to Gully's overly simplistic portrayal, it is not the people engaging in sexual sin who are the problem. It is the guy who points it out. This is the backwards morality of postmodernity, however inconsistently applied. In these categories, or those categories where it's found to serve the larger progressive agenda, bank robbery, no, sexual sin, yes, the criteria for weighing good and bad are reversed. Completely missing from Gully's account, however, is the idea that sin harms people, and that perhaps this elder was genuinely concerned with the damage that sexual sin causes in people's lives. In other words, it is possible, a shocking idea to many in our postmodern world, that it is actually loving to confront sin. Step 5, insist Jesus is on our or on your side. The final step in the justification of sexual sin is ostensibly to enlist the help of Jesus. To do so, Gully trots out the standard cliches about Jesus being more gracious to sinners than to legalists. He even appeals, not surprisingly, to the story of Jesus being anointed by the sinful woman. What Gully leaves out, however, is that the woman came to Jesus not defiant in her sins, but repentant of them. Indeed, Jesus indicates that, quote, her sins are many, unquote, but that they, quote, are forgiven, unquote. Luke chapter 7, verse 47. Yes, Jesus forgives sinners, but we must acknowledge and admit we are sinners. In sum, Gully's ninth commandment is a masterpiece of progressive Christianity. It runs through the classic playbook of justifying sexual sin and, at first glance, can seem quite compelling. But ultimately, it just doesn't hold up. We're not called to care about love instead of sex. We are called to care about both. As Paul reminds us, quote, set the believers an example in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, in purity, unquote. 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 12. And that was chapter 9, the ninth commandment of progressive Christianity. And the problem so far with this book, well, let me wait until after I get done with it. But it's one of the things that one notices when you're reading this is the neutrality in it. It's just whitewashed with neutrality. So, and that's too bad because that waters down the message. And the message is don't get involved in false Christianity. Not progressive Christianity, there's no such thing. It's just you're in a church that has the rainbow flag. You're not in a church. You're in a socialist clubhouse. Okay, it may make you feel good. Maybe make you feel good. There are scolds and nags, and that's the whole thing about it. If you go in there and question, for instance, to some of your fellow church members about why there's a rainbow flag out front, you're going to get judged so harshly you won't be able to stand it. It'll shock you how harshly you're judged. So again, the left always talk about don't judge because they want to be the ones to do the judging. So back in a minute. Thank you. And now I'm going to read chapter 6 from Russell Kirk about how to be a conservative. Chapter 6, Conservatives and the Community. A solitary man, Aristotle says, must be either a beast or a god. Since not many of us are godlike, we live in communities, lest we grow bestial. Community is a great good. It makes civilization and moral growth possible, and when community weakens, it's replaced not by anarchic freedom, ordinarily, but by stifling collectivism. Although we Americans have always been intensely attached to privacy and private rights, we also have been a nation conspicuous for a hearty and successful spirit of community. Now, real community is detested by the radical social reformer in our century who would like to see society forced into a single rigid mold characterized by central administration, rule through executive decree, uniformity of life, and eradication of all personal and local distinctions. The radical reformer is not the only enemy of true community nowadays. Certain great blind tendencies in modern technology and economic life also threaten traditional community. The true conservative is public-spirited. He believes in community. In a genuine community, the decisions which most directly affect the lives of citizens are made locally and voluntarily. The administration of justice, the police function, the maintenance of roads and public buildings, and communal amenities, the assessment and collection of taxes, the management of charities and hospitals, the establishment of schools, the supervision of economic development. The influences which make community healthy still are strong in America. For it is tempting and easy to let centralized power assume the burdens which necessarily accompany the privileges of community. I may add that this disintegration of community and its supplanting by centralized authority commonly have been accompanied by a proportionate decay of culture and morality, which seem to flourish only when local community teaches men and women standards of civilization and decency. For a nation is no stronger than the numerous little communities of which it is composed. Doubtless, it is often vexatious to serve on local school boards or to have to attend the meetings of private charitable societies or to pay for local improvements out of local funds or to put down crime through local reform. So, the thinking conservative does his duty by his community, his town, his country, his business organization, his civic association, his union, his church group, his professional body, his school or university, and his charitable fund. All these are parts of real community. He does not believe that he will have done his duty as a citizen if he merely votes for positive legislation calculated to let someone else afar off perform all the functions of these vital associations. Community is essential to freedom, to private rights, and to the whole fabric of the civil social order. Without it, men and women become less than human, either the solitary beasts of Aristotle's phrase or the servile mass people of the unitary state. The conservative does not pose as an anarchist, despising his duties towards other men, and he does not propose to exchange his birthright of community for the pottage of centralized utopia. And that was chapter 6 of the book by Russell Kirk about being a conservative. Thank you. One of the things that occurred to me yesterday was this struck me was this statement. I've heard it for years, but it's taken me this long to break the code, so to speak, on this, that about colorblind. There used to be a lot of talk about being colorblind in our society. What does that mean exactly? Does that mean that I should treat everybody as though they're white? So it seems to me it's one of those phrases that really doesn't have a meaning. It's just it sounds good, it feels good, but it really doesn't have any type of a meaning to it. Seems to me that the way that I should be treating people is as Americans, fellow Americans. And the way to hit back psychologically, at least in terms of diversity, because again, we got diversity and we've got the inclusivity, having everybody live together and work together, and conservatives are inclusive. Diversity is not a value. Ghettoization of this country is not a value. We want integration. Everybody becomes integrated, and the way to express that is by turning the phrases that you usually hear: African American, Asian American, Hispanic American, and turn that around and refer to them, insist on referring to people as American Africans, American Asian, American Hispanic, because that's what we have in common. That's where you're emphasizing integration. American European. I don't wear a kilt. I don't eat haggis. I don't speak with a Scottish brogue. Okay, so because there are some people in my ancestral tree that have Scottish in them, but I don't do that. I gave all that up. My family, my forebears gave all that up to be American.